and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really excited to welcome onto the program Gopal Patel. Gopal, thank you so much for making time for us.
Sam, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, I likewise. Really pleasure to meet you. You do so much amazing work. So for people who aren't already familiar, you're the co-founder and director of Bhumi Global, an international Hindu faith-inspired NGO that works to promote environmental care. You're also a senior advisor for the Center for Earth Ethics and an advisor to the WWF Beliefs and Values Program. And you've spent well over 10 years as an environmental activist and leader, addressing issues like climate change, biodiversity loss, and you're also serving on many other advisory capacities, the United Nations Multi-Faith Advisory Council, and you're on the advisory group for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, which is partly how I was like, well, he'll talk to me because of that, right? And so, because I know you must be so busy, you're doing so much amazing work. And so I'm really excited to chat about it. And first, I always am curious how people get into work with religion and environmental issues, because obviously for a lot of people, those are worlds apart. I think religion is just about the soul or heaven or God, and they forget about the earth. And then likewise, some environmentalists think environmental work is just science and policy and stuff like that. So how did these things come together for you?
Yeah. So, where should I just explain how I got into this work? Is that a good?
However, some people get real far back and they're like, when I was 4, some stuff happened,
Right.
So yeah, feel free to begin wherever you
I
think
wish
the
I was one of those people that said that when I was 4, I had a calling. No, my story is not that wonderful. It's pretty boring. But essentially, how I came into this work was I was born and raised in London, or just outside of London. That's where I grew up. And around the age of 16, 17, I decided I wanted to live a monastic life and walk away from the world and live in a like a monastery or an ashram in India. And I wasn't able to do that initially, but eventually, after I got my undergrad in computer science and a master's degree, I was able to spend a couple of years living in Hindu ashrams and monasteries, first in India for about a year, and then in a Hindu ashram in London. And I wouldn't say I was a monk. I would say I was monkeying around rather than living the life of a monk. But I did follow a certain kind of like regulated, regimented lifestyle, learning about Hinduism and specifically the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita and how those could be applied to the world. And so I did that life for a couple of years. And then I realized, you know what, this is just not for me. I like nice clothes, or I like nice food. I like going to the movies, and so I was like, all right, I need to, snap out of this. And so, but I didn't know what to do because I had a background in computer science. I had this training in Hindu kind of monastic life. And I was like, well, how do you marry these two worlds? They're very disconnected from each other. And thankfully, a friend and mentor of mine, at the same time as I was kind of having that kind of, not crisis, but kind of like that period in my life, he was starting a Hindu-based environmental initiative. And that was at the Center for Hindu Studies at Oxford University. And so he was like, well, why don't you come and, run this thing for us for a couple of months as you kind of get back on your feet and decide what you want to do with your life. And so that was like early 2009. And it was only going to be like a 6-month internship. And that 6-month internship now has turned into 10, 11, 12, 13-year career. I lose count how many years I've been doing it, because it just kind of snowballed and kind of grew and grew. And that was around the time when, the religion environment movement had already been established by that time, I'd say in the late, well, in 2009, 2010, but it was still growing, and there's a lot of energy and a lot of focus on what faiths could do. And I just found more and more opportunities, more resonance and connection with other people that were in this work. And so that's kind of how I kind of came into this. I wasn't necessarily looking for it. It kind of landed on my lap, and it kind of has served me well. And I've enjoyed, I wouldn't say every moment of it, but I've enjoyed most of it. In the years I've been doing it. So that's how I got into it, and that's what keeps me. That's how I kind of got here now.
Nice. I like that. I like the serendipity of it all. Especially, something happens once you start living the monastic life where you're kind of, putting a lightning rod up for like spiritual energies and kind of, serendipity, synchronicity, these kind of happy accidents. And so it's
Right,
interesting
right.
that it transitioned to something that even though you're not, living the monastic life, you're definitely bringing that kind of perspective to really bear on contemporary issues and still get to go to the movies, wear nice clothes.
Yeah, right. That that as you were saying, like that's often the challenge, which is like what is the role of religion, faith, spirituality in the world today? And and it's a question I ask myself often, especially here in the United States or Western Europe, where like traditional forms of religion are on the decline. So what is our contribution? How do we engage with the world? How do we stay relevant? And so like these questions, they can be asked on they can be answered on a theoretical level in a monastery, but you have to be out in the world to really know kind of how this still has meaning and purpose and relevance in people's lives. And so, and what bigger cause is there right now than the environmental crisis, right? So
Right. Yeah, exactly. The earth. Yeah, that's a pretty serious focus. And that's,
right.
of course, what you're working with is Bhumi Global. And of course, Bhumi is the Sanskrit word for earth. So yeah, and then, working with the Center for Earth Ethics. Yeah, I really appreciate that because to me, that is kind of the great work for religions right now is clearly like, look, we need a moral resource to help motivate people and guide people. And here's all these religions. Like, all right, get it, let's get the word out there a little bit. So I wonder if you could say some about what Boomi Global is, what kind of stuff you guys do.
Sure, yeah. So, we've been around in one shape or other since about 2009. So for the first 10 years or so, we were Bhumi Project because we were based at the Hindu Center at Oxford. And then a couple of years ago, we kind of span out of Oxford and became a registered nonprofit in the US. And so we were Bhumi Project, now we're Bhumi Global. And the work has remained the same, which is, by and large, education, capacity building, awareness raising amongst Hindu leaders, temples, communities across the world on the need to address environmental challenges. And so that takes shape in a variety of ways. Traditional, not Previously we did a lot of work with temples in India. We launched something called the Green Temples Guide. We were the co-founders of a program called the Green Pilgrimage Network, greening pilgrim sites across the world. And so there was a lot of around greening of religious infrastructure, and we were like practically involved in that in various ways. And then we found that we were better placed in terms of just convening, educating, rather than actually going to try and actually do the work, on the ground. And so, a lot of the work now is really around the education, awareness raising that we do, because what we always find is that Hindu leaders and communities want to do work on the environment, but they just don't know where to start, or they don't know how to message it appropriately for their communities. And so that's a lot of the work we do. And then lifting up stories as well. There's like in all traditions, there's so much good work that's happening when it comes to the environment. And so a lot of our work is just finding those good stories, lifting them up, connecting them with other people that are doing the good work as well. And then there's the advocacy work that we do at the UN, that's more in a multi-faith context, working with other religious groups around climate, biodiversity, ecosystem restoration, and kind of lifting that moral voice in those big spaces like the COPs and so on like that. So that's kind of what we do, broadly speaking.
Right. Yeah. Which is really quite a lot. There's a handful of things happening there. I like that, kind of move from working specifically with like greening the infrastructure of temples and then being like, oh wait, we can just educate people and they can do that themselves. So you can kind of get a sense of the extended reach here. That's just, it's so
Yeah.
much easier just to educate people to do that than to do that in each specific place. And what's that generally entail? Kind of like going solar or things like that? What are some of the things that temples do to go green?
Yeah, it varies in different parts of the world. So in India, solar is a big, and has been for many years now. A lot of temples in India have gone solar. One, just out of necessity, because electricity isn't always steady
Right.
in India, so it just provides them a steady source of energy. So it's oftentimes less for environmental reasons and more for just so they can literally keep the lights
Yeah.
on. So whatever works. But in India, a lot of the work was around waste management, recycling. That's an issue not just with Hindu temples in India, but in India in general, that waste management infrastructure, solid waste management infrastructure in cities, towns, villages is just, inadequate in a lot of places, or is just not managed properly. So a lot of the work was around that. A lot of work was around educating pilgrims around, how to behave in an environmentally friendly way when going on pilgrimage to India, to temples specifically,
Nice.
because, pilgrimage, at least from a Hindu sense, is it's not necessarily being at the destination, but it's the journey to get there, like the physical journey. And traditionally, a pilgrimage would take days, weeks, months to get to your place of pilgrimage, right? And it's almost like an evolution of consciousness as you're on that pilgrimage, because your heart develops, or your consciousness develops, being ready to absorb and be present in that place of pilgrimage. Now it's like you jump on a plane and you're there in like 30 minutes or 2 hours, and like, so that kind of that inner journey that would take place traditionally doesn't happen anymore when people go on pilgrimage, right? So they take their metropolitan, cosmopolitan lifestyle mentality from the big cities, and they take that to the place of pilgrimage, and there's no transformation, right? And so it's like, how do you revive that traditional sense of pilgrimage, that mindset that was there before? So that was a lot of the work, and working with temples to help them talk to pilgrims about that work as well.
Nice.
Here in the US, it has been more around energy efficiency, reducing carbon emissions, so on like that. Also just about how to talk about this to their congregants, to younger people in their community as well. Because like a lot of religious places in the West, seeing less and less people attending, especially younger people. So identifying ways that this could be messaged in a way that resonates to a different kind of demographic, who are maybe less interested in the religion, but more interested in the application of the religion to the world, and so how do you get that messaging right? So that's kind of, it's like everything, right? It has to be time, place, circumstance. It can't be the same message or engagement everywhere. So we've had to moderate ourselves as we've worked in different parts of the world.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think is so exciting about what you're doing is just the global scale of it all, and to be thinking about situations, just across the planet and across generations, and yeah, youth outreach. Like, hey, religion. I mean, I know because I teach a course on religion and the environment for undergraduates,
Mm.
and a lot of times they're there because it's like a core credit that they have to have some kind of religion class. And so
Interesting.
I'm just always being like, no, religion's cool, right, kids? And
Like,
like,
yeah, it's cool.
yeah. I'm like, not really, not so much. And so then trying to show them, well, maybe you don't have to believe in all these stories or something, but you can see they do have some power for
Right.
making some change in your lives. And you're like, okay, that I can kind of get on board with.
Yeah.
But the idea of, really, like praying or doing worship and stuff like that, I'm like, yeah, you'll get there. It might just take a few more years, and we'll see. Uh, yeah, so I appreciate that you're doing that. I guess it needs to be done for every generation. Is always have to figure out how to transmit this kind of knowledge
Yeah.
to the youth.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Well, and I like that you do interfaith work or multi-faith work.
Mm.
So obviously that's a big part of the stuff that the Forum on Religion and Ecology is always supporting
Right.
is really trying to work across traditions. It seems like Hinduism might be like pretty well set up for that, compared to some other traditions that maybe aren't as inclusive about different ways of being spiritual. Is Hinduism
Yeah.
maybe a little more pluralistic, kind
Yeah,
of inherently?
it's interesting you say that. I, I don't know if I'd say yes or no to that. I think every religion, every tradition has its hard edges or difficult edges, and Hinduism isn't without that. But I think every religion also has those aspects that allow for working with the other, or working with those who have different beliefs and, and traditions. And so for me, I always, when I really took seriously my kind of practice of Hinduism, that was always in the context, in an interfaith context. The people that I grew up with as a Hindu, let's say, were always doing interfaith work. So my Hinduism, when I kind of not turned to it, but when I embraced it more, in my early 20s, was always interfaith. There was always people around who were Hindus doing interfaith work, and so that's always been part of my ethos. But it's not the ethos of every Hindu I know, and that's fine. And it's not, I don't expect it to be. Just as like not every person of every other tradition goes all in on the interfaith work, right? Everyone focuses on different aspects, right? But definitely for me, because I grew up in an environment of interfaith, it's been natural for me and fulfilling for me spiritually as well to work with people of other faith traditions to address environmental concerns. It's actually, it's not a practice per se, but it's one of the things that gives me the most nourishment in my life. Spiritual nourishment is when I'm with a group of people from other traditions and we are all working on a common cause. For me, there's nothing more beautiful in the world than that. Yeah.
Oh, that's such a wonderful image. I think that's like, in any one tradition, you can get so much spiritual nourishment, but then there's something different that happens when you're doing that with people from other traditions and working on some common cause.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things, at my most optimistic, I think some of these challenges, mass extinction, climate change, that these could be the excuse for humans to finally come together and have this kind of global cooperation across cultures, across traditions. And to get any sense that that's actually happening, I think is really exciting.
Yeah. And I think we also, for me, it's also like we have to model the world that we want to create or that we want to live in. Right. And so, like you're saying, the world is going to have to confront certain realities, and people of different traditions and persuasions are going to have to come together to work, to address these common concerns. And so that needs to be baked in as we're working out the solutions. It's not like the solutions are made disconnected from everything and everyone, and then everyone comes together at the end and it all works. Like, it's not like that, right? It has to start off collaborative, from the get-go, and that spirit of trust and humility and without ego has to be the bedrock of the solution, because only from that space can a long-term sustainable solution be found, right? And so for me, that's so important for me. It's like we have to model that from not even day one, from day zero, before we even try to step forward. So yeah, because that is the world that we're moving towards without a doubt. And whether we either do it we either do it intentionally or we're forced to do it, right? So let's do it intentionally. That's the more smarter way to do it.
Yeah, really well said. I like that a lot. It's like, well, we're gonna be forced to deal with each other one way or another.
Right.
It's better if we do that intentionally. Otherwise, it could get pretty messy pretty quick. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, because I could imagine some people still really hold on to that idea of kind of, one individual or one organization that's going to come up with the solutions to save the world, and then they'll spread it out to all these other places.
Right.
Like, no, we're going to have to cooperate. Yeah, from the beginning. I like from day zero, especially. It's got to be in the back of your mind before you even start this kind of work.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I wonder for people who didn't, grow up in a kind of multi-faith or interfaith context, how would we encourage those kind of people to take that attitude, right? To have that sense that it is good to work with others, and doesn't mean you have to leave your tradition behind at all, but does mean you have to be open to this kind of dialogue with other perspectives, working toward common solutions.
Right.
Yeah. I know there's no easy answer to that. It's like, how can we teach everybody to just love one another? That's not simple. But yeah, I'm curious in your work what you've found.
Yeah, what I found, like even for myself individually, and what I see doing this work is like it's an evolution. It doesn't start, like for me, although when I embraced my tradition and I was surrounded by other Hindus who were doing interfaith work, it wasn't like I started doing interfaith work immediately with them. Like what I learned was that I first had to ground myself in my tradition and know what my tradition stood for, and knew what the boundaries were, or what the theology and the philosophy and the history was. I had to be firmly situated in my own tradition, right? And then that allowed me Because then what that allowed me to do was be strong in my faith and my conviction. Then what that allowed me is then like to encounter people of other traditions and to find the common ground and to be able to work with them for common solutions. Because I think oftentimes what can happen, and I think why some people of faith may be reluctant to work with people from other traditions, is because they may be seen as a threat, because like, oh, well, why do you believe this? Why do you worship that? Why do you look like this or wear this kind of clothing or eat this kind of food? Or, and unless and until we're comfortable in our own tradition, it can be a little bit scary to encounter another tradition which may be very alien to our own, right? So we really need to live and breathe our tradition in a way where we just embody it, right? And I found for me that was really helpful. And when I was able to do that, the interfaith work just came naturally to me. It wasn't like I sought it out intentionally. It just kind of emerged that like I met people of other traditions and we just connected immediately because I didn't see how they worship their God as an offense or an affront or a threat to how I worship my God, right? And that's oftentimes what the barrier is to interfaith collaboration, that your religion is a threat to my religion or your practice is a threat to my practice. And so I don't really talk about this, so you're really asking me to go to a space which I don't normally go to. But I think if I was to give advice to people who want to do interfaith work is first, ground yourself in your own tradition first, be comfortable in that. And then the doors will open because God, no one has a monopoly on God. Nobody has a monopoly on love or truth, right? God will manifest their grace throughout the world for every single person, right? And we have to be ready to receive that. But until we're fixed in our own personal conviction, it can be difficult to see God's manifestation in other places as well. I don't know. Maybe that's not helpful. Maybe that makes no sense. But like I said, you're pushing me here, Sam, a little bit.
Yep, I'm a tough interviewer, asking the hard questions, but especially something like that. I mean, it's like, yeah, there's certainly no clear answer. If there was, then we'd have fixed the world and it would all be harmonious already. But I appreciate that. It's just one of those things like a tree needs to have strong roots if it's going to branch out. And if you don't have that kind of rootedness, then yeah, other things are going to be a threat. And you'll feel like things are forcing you to convert or they're challenging you. It's like, no, these are just different ways. And if you're confident in your way, then you know that interacting with other people isn't going to damage you or take away your tradition. So no, I think that's pretty helpful. And that if you're not really rooted in your own tradition, it would be hard for you to do multi-faith work because you couldn't translate across them because you really wouldn't know what it is in the first place. It'd be like trying to learn all the world's languages, but not really having one that you have right. fluency in.
Yeah.
Like you got to be fluent in something. Otherwise learning the others is going to be hard.
Yeah. There's a beautiful quote. I don't know it verbatim, but I have a teacher, I have a guru, and in the Hindu tradition, like that's very common or used to be very common. And then my teacher has his teacher, has his teacher, has his teacher. There's a lineage of teachers. And so one of my previous teachers who lived in the 1800s in West Bengal, he said that, if we go into a place of worship and we see someone, if we go into a place of worship that is not our own, and we see someone worshiping their form of God in a way that we don't recognize, we should look at that and say, well, look how devoted this person is to their God. I am inspired to be equally devoted to my God in that same way, right? And so, like, rather seeing it this way, it's just seeing, wow, this person is so committed to their practice and to their tradition. I want to be equally committed, right? And so, like, that kind of rather than a race to the bottom, it's like a race to the top. I really want to be inspired by as many traditions and people as possible, so I could be the best version of myself and my devotion and my practice, right? So anyway, so that quote just came to mind as we were talking.
Yeah, that's good. That's a beautiful image, because even if that other person is totally wrong, look at how they are nonetheless demonstrating so much
right.
Strength and commitment, and so then it's like, if anything, I should be able to do better.
Right.
So yeah, I like that, the race to the top. I think that's pretty good. I'll definitely adopt that in the future. That works, and even if it's not people's religion, any kind of habit, if you see somebody enjoying food that you don't like and they're really enjoying it, and you're like, well, I should enjoy the food I eat more.
Right.
And let other people inspire you to be more committed to whatever you're doing in your life.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good.
Mm.
Um, well, speaking of those kind of things, of like how to get involved with like multi-faith work and things like that, I'm also curious with the environmental side of things.
Mm.
Generally, when I talk to people across, all kinds of backgrounds and things, when they think about responding to the environmental crisis, they think, well, we're going to have to lose our fancy lifestyles.
Mm.
And of course, religions are often telling us like the simple life is actually a good life.
Mhm.
And a life of extreme excess is bad. And yet somehow we live in a society where people are like, no, excess is the way to go.
Mm.
And simplicity isn't so popular anymore. And so, there's debates about whether we can have like ecological growth or green growth. And
Mm.
other people are saying, no, we can't have growth at all. Maybe we need degrowth.
Right.
So I'm wondering, how do you message this kind of stuff? Like, what are we driving people toward? Is it a life where we do have to scale back some of our luxuries? And how do we frame that to people? Do we need to encourage something like degrowth, or how do you get into that? Because obviously that's a big roadblock for a lot of people, especially in affluent places like the United States, where people really don't like the idea of driving less or eating less meat or no meat, and they feel like you're taking something away from them.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? It's like, what do our lives look like? You know, yeah. For me, it's God, for me, it's like, well, okay, there's a number of ways you can come at it. Firstly is, well, the statistics show that although America is the most wealthiest country in the world, the mental health crisis is terrible here. The opioid crisis, alcoholism, drug addiction, right? And so the data doesn't back up the kind of the myth that excess leads to happiness, because America is not the happiest country in the world by far, right? And so there's something we need to be honest about that, right? And then another aspect is, the message of simplicity. For me, I like to frame it in a message of moderation, because I think moderation allows for luxury. Like, we all like different things, whether it's like a nice luxurious ice cream or some nice clothes or something like that, right? So moderation means, well, I'll splurge a bit here on one thing, but on something else, I'll take it down a notch, to kind of like balance it out, right? So there's a level of moderation, whereas simplicity makes it sound like I have to wear hemp trousers and have a latrine in the backyard or something like that, right? We're not going back to those times, hopefully, right? And so moderation, and so I think the messaging has to encompass all of that. And then I think it's also playing to people's personal. At the end of the day, people are motivated to act for personal interest. I think that's the ultimate factor. That's the most common factor to motivate people. And so it's like, well, do you want to be able to go to Miami on vacation, in the future? Well, Miami is very prone to sea level rise, right, and things like that. Well, do you want to, like, I live on the East Coast here in the US, and we haven't had a winter this year. Like, there's been no winter. We've had like 2 snows, if that, right? And so it's like, well, do you want to continue being able to go skiing, or do you want to be able to experience the seasons, or visit the cherry blossoms in DC? Well, they bloomed a month early this year, so you missed it, right? And so
Right.
it's like, so I think when you speak to people's personal, somewhat selfish interests like that, I think there is more of an opportunity to kind of open them up for conversation. Um, so, but I don't have the answers to that. But that's just how sometimes I try to approach it, is just like talking about it on a really individual, personal level. And when you talk about food, I often say, 3 times a day you get to make a climate decision, which is like what you eat: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Like, your values are reflected on that plate in front of you. Your climate choices are reflected on that plate in front of you. And so if you are concerned about the environment, start there. Start with your food. Where does it come from? What are the carbon miles? Is it plant-based? Is it this? Is it that? So everyone has an interest, and we just need to find what that is. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the times we assume our interests, we assume the interests that motivate us are the interests that are going to motivate the mass of people, and that doesn't work. And so, the solutions all have to be localized. They have to be community to community, house to house. And I think that's where we can, move people in the direction that we need to.
Nice. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. The appeal to enlightened self-interest and like, no, this can help you. It's kind of like the example you were mentioning about like a Hindu temple that's going to go solar. And they're like, it's not because we care about the environment or anything. We just want the lights on. Like, hey, that's fine. I'll take it. Yeah. Whatever's going to motivate you to take those actions, that's a fine motivation.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's kind of one of those things where it's just like, well, we're going to just need to talk with each other and figure out what our motivations are and then kind of work from there.
Yeah. And, and it's like, I mean, it's not the same comparison, but it's like, even when something is like morally outrageous in front of our eyes, even then it's still hard to like say that's wrong. Like I think of like Gandhi and the British Empire, or we talk of slavery. That was, people saw the horrors of those things in front of their eyes, and by and large just accepted those systems.
Yeah.
Right. And the challenge of climate change is like, you don't see it in front of your eyes every single day. Right. And so how do you make something real, which is intangible for most people, or abstract, or in another part of the world? So the magnitude of the challenge cannot be underestimated in terms of like making people understand that this is something that's going to affect them and future generations in really significant ways.
Yeah. Those are tough examples because it's so true. It's kind of like people have said about the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, that it was like one third of the population killed another third of the population while another third sat by and just watched.
Right. Wow.
And that even when it's that in your face, people can still just be like, well, I'm just going about my normal routine and things are fine, not going to try to change the system. And then with something like climate change that's so slow moving and invisible and abstract to people, yeah, how do we bring that into their perception in a way where they would see that, oh, we should probably do something about this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very difficult. And you look back to successful social movements. I mean, Gandhi's a good example. And kind of like you were saying about like, well, we have to be the role models of how to do this. And Gandhi, of course, is a good example of that. Like, well, I'm just not wearing my fancy clothes anymore. I'm gonna just make my homespun, and like, that's good for that context. But I don't know if I'm gonna.
Well, you live in California, Sam. You could get away with just wearing a loincloth. No one would
That's
bat
true.
an eye.
That's true. Yeah, walking down the streets of San Francisco, nobody would have a problem with that at all. Like,
Same in New
no,
York. Yeah. We
I'm
just don't have
being
the
the
weather for it in New
change.
York.
That's true. That's true. Oh, that's funny. Well, speaking of like the severity of the kind of horrors of like the slave trade or like British colonialism in India, uh, I often get asked this question: do you think that if there is a bad enough crisis, if there's something really terrible, like a massive heat wave that kills hundreds of thousands of people, would that wake people up? And I never know what to say to that because I don't know the kind of, I'm sure psychologists are kind of studying how do people respond to crises. Would it help them be like, oh, I didn't realize climate change was as severe, we need to change our systems now?
Mm.
Or would they kind of just shut down because it's so overwhelming?
Yeah, I think people will respond to them, but it'll be a delayed response, in the sense like I think it'll be like a generationally delayed response. Like the people who, for example, the kids who grew up during the last financial crisis, right? Lived through their parents' homes being foreclosed or parents losing jobs and so on like that, right? And so although their parents weren't able to respond immediately to that financial crisis, the children have grown up having lived through that trauma and are now, calling out our global financial systems, being like, this cannot happen again, right? And so I think, it's the cliche, the youth of the future, whatever, that's always been said. But there's truth in that, in the sense that, like, if I'm not a parent, but if I was, my concern would be keep a roof over my head, food on the table for my family, and and so on. But my children who are growing up seeing that will think, well, when I'm in a position to do something about it, I will, and I think that's what I think. And we're seeing that. We're seeing children who have grown up through different crises, not just environmental, are now maturing into adults and saying, well, we're not going to stand for this anymore, or we need things to change. Right. And so I think the response will be delayed by about maybe like a generation or half a generation. But I met like a wonderful African American activist in Washington recently, and she told me she's the Trayvon Martin generation. And like for us who are older, when things like that happen in the news, they're just the news, right? But for people who are young, it's like that defines who they are, right? And so, so I think there will be a delayed response, and not there is a response now of younger people stepping up, from politicians to business leaders to activists who have seen the inaction and the kind of hypocrisy and are just calling it out and are pushing for change.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. That adds important nuance to the whole youth of the future, they'll fix it kind of thing. Because that always just sounds like kicking the can down the road.
Right.
But this is, yeah, that's a more subtle point. It's like, no, there are intergenerational dynamics to how to respond to crises. Because the people, the older people who are living through it just have to keep a roof over people's heads and things. And they can't affect like revolutionary change or anything like that. And then the next generation is like, all right, yeah, we're gonna change this. We're not gonna stand for this anymore. And that's hopeful. And and you think of, geez, the people, I mean, the Trayvon Martin generation, the 2007, 2008 financial collapse, climate crisis. I guess the flip side of that is this younger generation, because I think feels so burdened by all that they have these skyrocketing rates of like eco anxiety. And so I wonder, I think this is one of the places that religions can really contribute, because obviously religions have all kinds of practices to help us deal with challenging emotions. So, I mean, I'm sure, even for you or for folks older than us, I mean, it's a lot, especially when you're studying it all the time and studying some of the worst things. I mean, like mass extinction, that's a lot. Even just climate change is a lot. Mass extinction, you're talking about something on the scale of 65 million years. Like that's kind of a lot to deal with. So I'm wondering, how does any kind of work with emotions show up in what you're doing? Because obviously it's a big part of it, and yet it's not necessarily something that's getting talked about much. I think even eco anxiety only showed up as a term in the Oxford English Dictionary like a year or two ago. So it's like pretty new to talk about things this way. But I know for younger people especially, they're feeling it.
Yeah, no, they certainly are. And this is, I'm not really doing work on this at the moment in any kind of practical way, but I have been thinking about it more. I wrote a chapter in a book a few years ago now on Hindu approaches to climate trauma and how Hinduism can help people address, climate trauma. And I think there is, and then, so there's that. And then the other thing is, like, what is the role of religion in the climate movement in the world right now? When, at least here in the West, organized established religion is on the decline. And so these younger people that we're talking about often will not subscribe to a particular faith tradition, right? And you see that pretty much across the board with all the established religions in the West, right? And so you have a generation of people growing up through trauma, not having access to the religion or the spiritual tools that maybe their parents or grandparents had, but are in need of those so much more than maybe what their parents needed, right? Yeah. And so I think, some of the work I'm doing in terms of at least thinking about it and trying to write about it is, well, how do we as people of faith, kind of get out of our boxes, get out of our silos and translate our worldviews, our frameworks for dealing with crisis to help those people who need it, but won't come to the church or the place of worship on a Sunday to kind of receive it.
Right.
right? And I think in terms of a value add for the religious environmental movement, I think that is a gaping opportunity for us and need that, as you were just saying, no one else can really fill. Like we as faiths, so we have models of resilience because we've been around for thousands of years. Which other
Yeah.
institutions have been around as long as we have? There's something in us that allows us to survive crises and generations and displacement and genocide and famine and war. We're still around, right? Yeah. So how do we distill that in a way and help people who need a sense of that without necessarily making them have to believe in God or the divine or the supernatural, right? And
Right.
I think that's I'm really interested in that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, to get a little more into that, what is there anything specifically from
Mm-hmm.
Hinduism, for instance, that
Yeah.
could translate? Some things are easier to translate than others,
Mm-hmm.
but especially, I mean, there's so much rich, myth
Mm-hmm.
and philosophy and things like that in Hinduism. So I'm wondering what's an example of something, and then
Mm-hmm.
how would you translate that to somebody who's a little shy about committing to religion?
Yeah, of course. So going back to this chapter I wrote, I think the book was called the book is on Hindu chaplaincy. I forget what the exact
Hmm.
title was, but in the book, the chapter I wrote on climate trauma, I put forward a triple S framework for addressing climate trauma. I say there are three things one can do to address any climate anxiety or trauma, which is savor, sangha, and satsang. Sorry, let me start again. Savor, sadhana, and satsang. And so savor means to do some practical action because with the climate crisis we feel so impotent, we feel like we can't do anything that's actually going to contribute to the solution. It makes us feel useless and worthless. And so what I suggested was that just do something, like plant a tree, give a donation to an NGO, like at least doing some kind of activity gives yourself agency, and that you're also part of the fight, right? So just do something, no matter how small. So that's the savor part. The satsang part is have a supportive community around yourself, because climate change is oftentimes feels very lonely, isolating. It can make you feel disconnected from your family and loved ones, or worried about their future, that they're not going to have a place to live or they may have to move, right? So grounding yourself in a supportive community is both nourishing but also grounding
Mhm.
as well. And the final one, sadhana, you know, traditionally in Hinduism, that meant like having a daily religious practice of whether like chanting or meditating or something like that. So I suggest have a daily practice, again, that grounds you. Like even if the whole world is changing around you, if you know every day for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, you are doing the same thing at the same time, it just gives you a sense of grounding. Even if the world is burning, like at least you are doing your one
Right.
thing that you are in control of, that no one else can interrupt. And so, and those ideas aren't radical ideas from Hinduism of service, of community, of practice. No, those are found in all religious traditions, right, in one shape or other. And so that's the kind of translation I think that needs to happen from the faiths into the climate and other kind of social spaces.
Nice. I like that because it's translating in a couple directions
Mhm.
where that would work. It's like grounded in Hinduism, but that would work in any religious tradition, and it would work for people who aren't grounded in any religious tradition at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's a good way to do it. Plus, I think we have to mention the fact that alliteration counts for a lot, and having the three S's, then it's easy to remember, and you're like, yep, the three S's, I'll do that. And that's a handy way to. You got to make it handy.
That's
It
it.
can't
That's
be
it.
too complicated. I think it's always good to have acronyms, alliteration, stuff like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's easy to miss how important that is. But yeah, for this kind of messaging, it makes it seem simple. Otherwise, something like telling people, "Hey, I've got some practices you can help with your trauma." They're like, "This is already feels like too much."
Right.
Then to
Right.
simplify it, it's just the three S's. It's very easily digestible. So yeah, that's great. I'll have to check out this chapter. That's just fantastic.
Yeah.
I like it a lot. Well, geez, I'm trying to think of other ways I can ask you how to save the world. 'Cause, I like all the I like all the
Well,
answers that you have so
well,
far.
I would say, as we're probably coming up to the end, is like, we all need to have a story, you know, we all need to have a story. And, it's like one thing that has made faith resilient is that we have stories that are larger than ourselves, and that we situate ourselves in those stories within history, within the people that came before us. Right. So we all individually need to know what our story is. Like, what is the story that we're feeding into, that we're part of, and what is our own personal story? And I think that is really, really empowering and important for people. And so, and I'm saying that because you just said to save the world. And I would say, I'm not here to save the world. You know, I'm here to do my contribution. I'm here to cause the least amount of suffering and harm to other people and the planet. And if that leads to a better world, great. And if it doesn't, well, at least I did the best I could to be the best version of myself, right? And so, like, that's part of my story. And that's also the story of the Bhagavad Gita, which is you're entitled to act in the world, but you're not entitled to the fruits of your acts, right? And so that's my larger story, which is like I have to work in a spirit of detachment. That's what my tradition teaches me. And my own personal story is I'm not saving the world. I'm just going to try my best. And everyone needs to find that for themselves.
All right, that's good. That sounds like the kind of stuff that could, though, save the world. Like, well, one of the things is you're going to have some non-attachment toward the project of saving the world. So yeah, as you were saying that, I'm like, this is clearly the Gita. Yeah, clearly, such a great example. It reminds me, Martin Luther King had a similar story of, if I had like a sapling of an apple tree in my hand, and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt the world is going to end tomorrow, I'd plant that sapling.
Right.
And because you're not doing it for the fruits, you're
Mm-hmm.
doing it because it's the right thing to do,
Yeah.
and not because you're attached to the outcome.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, beautifully said. Well, geez, yeah, I don't want to keep you much longer because I'm trying to make a good impression, so we can do this again sometime.
I would
Um,
love to be back on. This has been great. Yeah.
but I'm curious, what's next? What do you have kind of in the mix right now, right? Because we're starting spring 2023.
Yeah.
What's kind of coming up for these next couple seasons?
Yeah, I love the way that's framed, the coming seasons. I like that. Yeah. So a couple of things. One of the big things I'm working on right now is with the Center for Earth Ethics, working on spiritual principles for ecosystem restoration. And so I sit on the advisory board for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And over the last year or so, we've been working to kind of think, how does spirituality, culture, and values, how can they strengthen ecosystem restoration projects globally? And so with the Center for Earth Ethics, we'll be coming out with these 10 spiritual principles in the coming months, which we think will really strengthen the restoration movement, but also the climate and biodiversity movements globally. And then, I'm doing a lot of work thinking with others in this space around, in this moment, and I mentioned it earlier, what is the contribution of the religious environmental movement? We've been around for a long time, and we've been successful. People know we exist. There are now so many efforts mobilizing religion on environment. But given the acuteness of the crisis that we're in, what is our value add? And that's a conversation we're having at Bhumi Global, and it's a conversation I'm having with people from other traditions as well, which is, what can we do now? What should we do? Do we just keep doing what we've done for decades, or do we need to change tact or approach, or, and so I think that's the larger body of work I'm working on right now, which is like, what can we do? What do we need to be doing now? Because things are not looking good. And that's a conversation I would ask everyone into if they're interested, because we all need to be thinking like that, I think.
Yeah, nice. That's exciting. Exciting projects. And so, yeah, we'll have to do this again sometime to hear how those things developed, because it's really informative, but also deeply inspiring. So, so thanks for all your work, and even though you're not attached to the fruits of that labor, but I sure appreciate them.
No, I'm not saying I'm not attached. I'm very much attached. I'm trying not to be attached, but I'm not,
That's
I'm
true.
not pretending,
We wouldn't have to practice non-attachment if we weren't attached.
There you go. There you
Yeah,
go.
very good. Well, Gopal Patel, thanks so much for making time for us. This was really a treat.
Likewise,
And
it's been really great. Yeah.
thanks for everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you later. In the meantime, take care.